In South Africa, there is a cave which tells us an interesting story about human beings and our place on the earth. So, in the cave which has been excavated, one finds full skeletal remains of large cats, predatory cats, which tells us that this was a den of these animals. Additionally, there are many fragmentary bones of various other animals in the cave, smaller animals, and all of these bones have tooth marks of these large cats, which tells us that these smaller animals were brought inside the den and eaten by these predators. Among these bones which were eaten, bones of the prey, are bones of Homo erectus, of course, our ancestor. Then, at a much later level, after a few generations of the cave being uninhabited for a while, we find different forms of remains. In the sediments, first of all, are detectable traces of burnt carbon, a sign that in these intervening years, early man had domesticated that elemental force, and this carbon had come into the cave, possibly through the wind. Now, later, some years later, in the cave, we also find now the full skeletal remains, without tooth marks, of course, of Homo erectus, meaning that now the cave was a home of these people, these early people. Now, the story gets interesting. Now we find remains of many other animals, but now they have marks on their bones which are made from the teeth of these men. So they are cooking and eating these small animals. We find reptiles and birds and various other smaller mammals. But most interestingly, we find cooked remains of the same large cats or their descendants who had once been eating human beings in this cave. So, we talk about great archaeological discoveries. This perhaps is the greatest of them all. This is historic. Predator becoming the prey becoming the hunter, and man rising to the top of the food chain. It began with the control of fire. Now, James Scott, in his book Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States, begins his thesis with two main propositions, or two main arguments. That the use of fire by man was the beginning of the Deep Anthropocene era, or the first age of man. The process that led to the so-called agriculture revolution, which happened many millennia later, began with man's use of fire to reshape nature or the texture of the earth for niche construction. So, niche construction refers to the transformation of the physical environment by any organism to make it more conducive for its habitation. So, other organisms also practice niche construction, from worms to ants to birds and beavers and even elephants. Numerous organisms have evolved the skills for niche construction, but human beings. Scott says human beings, beginning from around 400,000 years ago, they used fire, and fire became such an important tool for niche construction that most of the habitable land of the earth has in fact been shaped by the human use of fire from 400,000 years ago, the beginning of the Deep Anthropocene. Over millennia, human beings have, in a sense, terraformed the entire earth as a niche where we as a species can dominate. The trophic system has never been the same. So Scott says, fire was the key to humankind's growing sway over the natural world, a species monopoly, a trump card worldwide. The Amazonian rainforests bear indelible traces of the use of fire to clear land and open the canopy. Australia's eucalyptus landscape is to a large and considerable degree the effect of human fire. The volume of such landscaping in North America was such that when it stopped abruptly due to devastating epidemics that came with the Europeans, the newly unchecked growth of forest cover created the illusion among white settlers that North America was virtually untouched and was a primeval forest. According to some climatologists, the cold spell known as the Little Ice Age, from roughly 1500 to 1850 AD, may well have been due to the reduction of CO2 in the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas brought about by the die off of North America's indigenous fire farmers. So, North America's fire farmers were clearing so much forest that almost all the forests of North America had been cleared. And when Europeans arrived in North America, due to epidemics as the natives they started dying in huge numbers, which was a tragedy in itself. But the forests began to grow again. And to the Europeans, it seemed as if this was a primeval forest. And these forests, they pulled out so much carbon, CO2, from the earth that it cooled the earth for 350 years. So human beings can reshape the entire continents with fire. But going back in time, another important use of fire, perhaps discovered while performing the niche construction of terraforming the earth, was cooking. As cooking allowed early man to gather and eat a far wider range of foods than before. Plants with thorns, thick skins, and bark could be opened, peeled, and detoxified by cooking. Hard seeds and fibrous foods that would not have repaid the caloric costs of digesting them now became palatable. The flesh and guts of small birds and rodents could be sterilized before eating. Even before the advent of cooking, Homo sapiens was a broad spectrum omnivore. He was pounding, grinding, mashing, fermenting, and pickling raw meats and plants. But with fire, the range of foods she could digest expanded exponentially. As testimony to that range, an archaeological site in the Rift Valley, dated 23,000 years ago, gives evidence of a diet spanning 4 food webs. That is, food which is sourced from water, from woodland, from grassland, and from arid ecologies. So, 4 different ecologies, 4 different food webs. And this food, the remains of this food from this site, encompass at least 20 large and small animals, 16 families of birds, 140 kinds of fruit, nuts, and seeds and pulses, not to mention plants for medicinal and craft purposes, for making baskets, weaving, for traps, etc. So this was the variety of diet that human beings could eat. So cooking has had a fundamentally important effect on human evolution. At least according to Richard Wrangham, who in his book Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human, proposes that the externalization of a substantial part of our digestive process indirectly led to the evolution of larger brains in human beings. So Homo erectus began cooking, and that indirectly led to larger brains in later species of human beings. So cooking was a technological innovation in the development of nutritional efficiency, leading to our digestive tracts becoming much shorter than other mammals. Even other primates have 3 times longer digestive tracts than human beings. And since we required much less energy to extract sufficient nutrition from the food that we ingested, the extra energy that wasn't required for digesting our food now was absorbed by the brain, which gradually became larger and larger as Homo erectus evolved into Homo sapiens. So fire aided those ancient ancestors of ours, to revenge the death of their fathers at the hands of the saber-tooth and perhaps other animals. It made them deadly. It also made them smarter. It should be mentioned that not all anthropologists agree with this thesis proposed by Wrangham, but it is widely accepted. So, the use of fire gave human beings the power to control their environment. This was especially important during the Long Ice Age, allowing primal humanoid species such as Neanderthals to spread into Europe and the Cro-Magnon man to expand elsewhere across the world. During this time after the control of fire, many millennia into the Deep Anthropocene, since various species of human beings were already at the top of the trophic system, which is the food web. The great wars for domination of the earth were initially fought between these different humanoid species, different types of human beings. We might call them human beings, Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon, and various others. That is a story that we might explore from Steve Mithen's After the Ice, which is another excellent book. So returning to Scott, the second great change he focuses on was the rapid terraforming of the earth through its own processes after this long ice age, during which human beings are spreading all across the earth. And these processes are perhaps with a little bit of nudge by the early greenhouse effect of the use of all the fire, the end of the ice age or the end of the last glacial maximum. So this is the second major shift in human evolution. The warming of the earth began roughly 22,000 years ago, with a brief snapback period, cooling period in the middle known as the older Dryas and the younger Dryas. So by this time, human beings had already spread to most spaces in the world, and Homo sapiens had become the sole human species, having outcompeted the others to remain as the sole masters of the earth, which is modern human beings. Perhaps a few pockets of other humanoids remained here and there, such as the so-called hobbits of Southeast Asia, technically called, let me see if I can pronounce this, the Homo floresiensis. It was once thought that this species, known as the hobbit, which are a small humanoid species, survived till 12,000 years ago, so well after the Ice Age. But new evidence suggests that they, in fact, died off around 20,000 years ago, which is a shame. So Scott treats this transition from the Ice Age to this new warmer Earth as an important period during which human beings began to adapt to this changing world. He's rather abrupt in his treatment of the Ice Age and the effect on human social evolution till within a few millennia of the younger Dryas. To fill in the gap, one can turn to Steve Mithen's After the Ice, which is another excellent book. But for Scott, the goal is primarily to show how from the deep Anthropocene of 400,000 years ago, humanity now graduated to the next stage of what we might call the Middle Anthropocene, which begins roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years before present, so around 10,000 BC. Scott doesn't use the term Middle Anthropocene, but since he used the term Deep Anthropocene, I am using the term Middle Anthropocene beginning from now, which is very useful, as you will see in the analysis. So this Middle Anthropocene roughly begins from 12,000 years ago. So in this Middle Anthropocene, human beings moved from niche construction over wide spaces, which had happened all throughout the long millennia of the Deep Anthropocene, which of course began from 400,000 years ago. So in this Middle Anthropocene, human beings moved from niche construction over these wide spaces of the earth to niche habitation in more localized places. That is a transition from moving to a settled lifestyle, from nomadism to sedentism. And this shift to sedentism in the post-Ice Age Middle Anthropocene, as we approach the post-Ice Age Middle Anthropocene, was an adaptive response to changes in the environment, of course. The warming of the earth was a gradual process, beginning with the thawing of the great ice sheets of the northern latitudes. Human beings dispersed over wider and wider spaces during these millennia. However, as mentioned before, even during this larger trend towards a warming earth, there were shorter in terms of geological times, but millennia long otherwise periods of rapid cooling, which are known as the older and the younger Dryas. So our Middle Anthropocene commences essentially after this period known as the younger Dryas. But the socio-evolutionary processes which led to the Middle Anthropocene, to the particular nature of the Middle Anthropocene, which we will now explore, are identifiable, and they began to develop during these long years of adaptation to this changing earth. To understand the effect of these long years after the Ice Age, so from 22,000 years to about 10,000 years as we approach the Middle Anthropocene, we can sum it up as follows. In the warmer periods, human beings dispersed into newer and newer lands, exploring wider and wider spaces across Eurasia and into the Americas. while during the shorter, colder periods, they might have concentrated into what we might call refugia of forests with fresh water, of oases or warmer wetlands of relative abundance compared to the colder earth. It was most likely in such refugia that the first experiments with nurturing grain bearing grasses began. However, agriculture, while known, was not, Scott stresses, seen as a necessity for these early experiments with sedentary life. And the earliest large fixed settlements sprang up in wetlands, not arid settings. They relied overwhelmingly on wetland resources, not grains, for their subsistence. And they had no need of irrigation in the generally understood sense of the term. Insofar as any human landscaping was necessary in this setting, in the wetland setting, it was more likely to be drainage than irrigation, that is, removing rather than bringing water into where human beings lived. Because these, remember, were wetland zones, these refugia where human beings concentrated during the colder periods. So remember, there's a phase. The Ice Age ends around 22,000 years ago. Then the Earth begins to warm. But during these years, long millennia of warming, there are these two brief periods of colder ages. So two brief millennia, which are cold, interspersed between these 10 years, 10 millennia of a warming Earth. 10 years. Moving on. So these wetland zones provided sufficient nutrition to people, a veritable protein harvest, as Scott calls it, of fish, birds, turtles, and even wild, free-growing plants. So the inhabitants of these marshes, these wetlands, lived on what are called turtlebacks, which are small patches of slightly higher ground compared to cheniers in the Mississippi River Delta, often no more than a meter or so above the high water mark. From these turtlebacks, inhabitants exploited virtually all the wetland resources within their reach, reeds and sedges for building and also for food, a great variety of edible plants, which included clubrush, cattails, water lily, bulrush, tortoises, fish, mollusks, crustaceans, which are crabs, birds, waterfowl, small mammals, and also migrating gazelles that provided a major source of protein. The combination of rich alluvial soils with an estuary of great rivers, where these wetlands were generally located, which were teeming with nutrients, dead and alive, made for an exceptionally rich riparian life, and in turn attracted huge numbers of fish, turtles, birds, and mammals, not to mention human beings. So all these animals concentrated into these wetlands whenever the earth got colder, and they expanded outwards whenever the earth got warmer. Preying on creatures, all these animals preyed on creatures lower down the food chain. And of course, at the top of the food chain now were human beings who preyed on everything else, also on other human beings. These wet conditions were rich and diverse and abundant in stable and resilient resources, and they were ideal for hunter-gatherers to sort of settle and obtain all their resources from the local vicinity. So during these long millennia of wetland subsistence in key zones, human beings also began to develop various skills in nurturing the plant life around them, which included burning of undesirable flora, weeding wild stands of favored plants and trees to eliminate competitors, pruning, thinning, selective harvesting, trimming, transplanting, mulching, relocating protective insects, bark ringing, coppicing, watering, and fertilizing. So as Scott stresses, there wasn't one specific moment in human history when human beings made a sudden jump from hunting-gathering to farming. Or in other words, there was no agricultural revolution similar to our industrial revolution. Human beings began to settle into these zones, and they began to use all these techniques available to them to create their niches, to make the niches where they had settled more and more conducive for their habitation. So there was no one single agricultural revolution similar to our, say, industrial revolution, which happened in a short span of time. So which makes one think, if you take a long scale of time to analyze it, was there even an industrial revolution? So This long process of the human control of our environment and the things that inhabited it was essentially us getting better and better at niche construction. While this sort of food gardening was something we developed during these long millennia of wetland sedentism, human beings, in fact, had been making similar interventions. Also, remember, in the animal world, so we're controlling not just the plants, but also animals. So, Scott says, short of full domestication, hunters have long been burning to encourage browse for prey. They've been burning the ground so that grass would grow and prey would come to feed on that grass and we would feed on that prey. And they would spare females of reproductive age so the prey could reproduce. They would cull weaker animals so stronger offspring would be produced. And they would hunt based on the life cycles and the population and hunt different herds at different times. They would fish selectively. They would manage streams and other waters to promote spawning and shellfish beds. They would transplant the eggs and the young of birds and fish, manipulating the habitat, so taking animals to different places. And they would occasionally also raise juveniles of animals, so younger animals who were left without their parents would often be raised by these human beings. Initially, perhaps as pets, but gradually this might have led to domestication. So we were, with every passing generation, increasing the scale and intensity of niche construction by managing, modifying, and domesticating more and more of our environment. We proceeded from the domestication of the elements to domestication of the environment, to domestication of animals, then plants, and in the process, to the domestication of us, human beings. And here begins the second major theme in Scott's thesis. Domestication of our environments and our sources of food was ultimately a huge break in the process of human evolution. Essentially from around 7,000 to 6,500 BC, which is from 9,000 to 9,000 years ago, when human beings began to rely primarily on agriculture for food supply, there was a divergence in human evolution into two types of societies. So, these two types of societies which began to evolve from around 9,000 years ago. So, there were the older society of the moving people, the traditional hunter-gatherers, and who lived in the old sort of lifestyle, also using these various techniques that we have been discussing occasionally. And then there was a new society which began to develop from around 9,000 BC, settled societies of farmers. Remember, there was this period of adaptation, and after this period of adaptation, these two types of distinct societies began to develop. So, this development of more settled societies, was contingent on human beings getting more and more rooted into their domestic habitat or domus. So, as they were cultivating all this land around them, as they were creating this niche around them, or not cultivating land right now, creating these niches, they began to get more and more settled. And they began to get more and more settled into their domestic habitat, becoming domesticated. They began to live in what is called the domus, a domus kind of lifestyle. And the older people, the people who followed the older ways, we might call them as inhabiting the ordos or living in an ordos-based culture. So let me just explain these two terms, domus and ordos. So the domus is from the word from which you derive the word domestic, and Scott uses that word to describe this camp, this settlement camp where human beings began to settle. And ordus is a word that I use to contrast it with domus. So I have adopted this term from the Turkic word orda, which means camp, and refers to the command tent in the army of Turco-Mongol nomad warriors. Essentially, what I mean by ordus is a camp culture, as opposed to the settled culture of the domus. So these are the two distinct types of societies that began to develop from around 9,000 years ago. These two ways of life had a completely different rhythm or tempo, and Scott says that it would be no exaggeration to say that hunting and foraging are in terms of complexity as different from cereal grain farming as cereal grain farming is in turn removed from the repetitive work on a modern assembly line. So as different as agriculture is from industry. So each step represents a substantial narrowing of focus and a simplification of tasks. So if you've read Adam Smith, he talks about a pin factory. and how the more specialized your production line is, the more pins that you can produce. So essentially, when you're living in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, that is the old Ordos way of life, you are doing more and more. You are hunting, you're foraging, you're fishing, and you're deriving various kinds of food from various kinds of environments. And when you begin to live in a domus lifestyle, you're essentially focused on just growing your crop. So that is a simplification. And when, of course, you're producing pins, then you're only focusing on producing that part of your pin. Right. So, so simplification, of course, is one way to put it. The other way to put it is that your life gets really boring. I mean, what kind of a life is it to just keep producing pins all your life, right? And even the transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a farming lifestyle was in fact coming down in a sense. So why after this life of abundance in wetland settlements as hunter-gatherers, supplemented by foraging, hunting, where you had these different kinds of foods and nutritions, of many millennia, remember, many millennia after the end of the Ice Age, that was the only way that human beings lived. It was only during the colder periods that human beings began to settle into these wetland zones. So why, despite this other way of life, did human beings accept the drudgery ridden agriculture based life? So Scott says such a transition could only have happened with a gun on the head. And what was that gun on the head? For that, we need to explore his hypothesis and his entire mapping out of this transition in a deeper sense. So, what Scott says. The hypothesis he proposes is interesting. It goes as follows. From after the end of the Ice Age, which is the long Ice Age, that ended 20,000 years ago, as the Earth began to warm, there was a larger and larger availability of both wetland zones and wide open pasture lands. So human beings began to develop that Ordos lifestyle. But consequently, as older and younger dryas, these smaller Ice Age periods happened, human beings began to gravitate towards these wetland zones, which became centers of early sedentism. Right. So that is when the branching out began to happen. But even during this early sedentism, this early experiments with sedentism, in addition to deriving their nutrition from the protein harvests of the aquatic and avian life, they supplemented their food with hunting. So these wetland zones were corridors for seasonal migrations of herds of animals. So they were good grounds for hunting. They were also good grounds for foraging. So pastoralism also began to develop around these grounds. So look at how these transitions are happening. So, it was during these early experiments with sedentism that all necessary knowledge and technology for farming was developed, without there being the need for farming. Because, of course, there is an abundance of nutrition all around you. You don't need to do that drudgery filled work of farming. So, but what was the technology that was developed? This included knowledge of grain bearing grasses, invention of sickles for harvesting, and all the necessary tools for winnowing, pounding, and grinding. But harvesting of starch-based grains remained a supplementary side activity. Grains might in fact have been generally used for fermentation. So barley might have been used to produce beer. And that was the best use for grains earlier on. So you hunted animals and you had some beer to drink. So it was only after the cold wave of the Younger Dryas, with some effects lingering longer. So the Younger Dryas ended around 10,000 years ago, and the effects lingered on slightly longer, because during this colder period, remember the Younger Dryas lasted for 1,000 years. I keep reiterating that. So it lasted for 1,000 years, but populations of humans had thrived. Human beings had grown during these last millennia. But during the Younger Dryas, other animals and other key creatures and other plant life had reduced. So even during this small period, this small 1,000 year period of a colder Earth, when human populations had grown, other sources of nutrition had become scarce all around them. So this rich lifestyle that existed before, that couldn't be sustained any longer. Then human beings had to turn to farming. And then farming became the primary, mode of subsistence. So this is how this transition happened. And this is reflected in the archaeological record of key sites in the Mesopotamian region, such as Eridu at Abu Shariar in southern Iraq, which I have discussed before. So life as farmers was much harder than earlier. The earlier life was almost an idyllic life, as described by James Scott. Earlier, life in a sense danced to the rhythm of nature. Now, it revolved around the cultivation of one or two starch-growing crops. And the gathering, pounding, and grinding of which earlier had only been occasional activities, generally to make beer, now required year-long to make food. Not only did this life become much more dull, but it led to serious stress injuries, especially in women who did most of this food processing work. And these injuries are detectable in skeletal remains of the period even till today. But remember, this was the domus life. This was the settled life. One must recall there was another option for human beings, the life of the ordos, although things might have been scarcer and you might have to roam further, but that was still an option, and a substantial portion of the human population, even during this time, at around 7,000 to 6,000 BC, was still living the life of the ordos rather than the domos. So as discussed above, human society from around this transitional period after the Younger Dryas had begun to evolve into two distinct directions. Around the center of the domos, where the first agriculture-based civilizations would grow, which of course were contingent, as we will discuss in a further lecture, on the development of bureaucratic states. And the second type of life was the life of the ordos, which were the wide life of people in the wide open grasslands, especially of Eurasia, where the stateless peoples of the ordos roamed. And moving on, we will see how conflict between these moving and settled people would become a defining plot in a sense of human history, till the beginning of early modernity perhaps, lasting right till the fall of the last Central Asian nomad warrior empires. So moving towards closing this essay and setting the agenda for the next presentation. So of course, we will discuss this theme of conflict between the domus and the ordos, and we will also see how the earliest states developed in Mesopotamia, more accurately the southern alluvium of Sumeria, and also in the Nile River region around the various bends and curves in the river, among key strategic mountain routes and valleys in the Iranian highlands, which were fed by mountain streams, and in the riverine plains of the Indus River system in the Indian subcontinent, where there are 7 grand rivers where a civilization, domus-based civilization, would grow. So these riverine zones were primary centers of domus civilization because they already had high concentrations of population or people living that earlier sort of idyllic and rich lifestyle, and they were forced to turn to farming after the Ice Age. The Younger Dryas, again, I must stress. So while most of the rest of the inhabitable world was the realms of the various ordos-based cultures, of course, and there were interactions between the stomus-based and ordos-based cultures. Occasionally, these interactions would lead to some hybrid cultures developing, which were between the ordos and the domos. But these were momentary and almost always transitioned into purely domus-based cultures. Why this happened is something we will explore in the next part of this series. So in the next part of the essay, we will stay with James Scott. We will discuss his views on the development of the state and its many conflicts with the moving people, the people of the ordos, which it labeled as barbarians, and also surprisingly also with its own people, who in a way were domesticates of the state, domesticates especially of the elites of the state, much like the many domesticated animals who now also inhabited the society of the domos. We will explore this transition, the second transition of the Middle Anthropocene, and we already have some lectures on early civilizations, but now we will be doing this more theoretically as we have done in this lecture.